This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Morning. I don't normally use PowerPoint, so this is a bit of an experiment, so bear with me. Okay. So while sisterhood, I don't know why the Skype keeps happening. I might just do without it. Okay. No. Okay. For some reason, the Skype. I've tried to quit the Skype program, and for some reason it keeps popping up. So I guess we'll just.
Yeah, we can talk to it.
Yeah. Okay. We'll get used to it. All right then. Okay. So while sisterhood is the familial metaphor most often associated with feminist discourse, the use of maternal metaphors, such as feminist foremothers, has become increasingly prevalent within Anglophone and European feminist writing over the past 40 years. Feminists have constructed generational matrilineal histories in order to build intellectual and emotional connections between women of different ages and eras. Yet whilst the intention of such generational and matrilineal symbolism is to build constructive connections between feminists across time, feminists have become increasingly concerned that the persistent mobilization of mother-daughter tropes and the over-maternalization of feminism is in fact having divisive effects. Criticisms of the generational or matrilineal paradigm tend to focus upon the related tropes of anxiety and conflict. In the first instance, envisaging feminism as a singular journey, whereby each generation builds on the gains of the previous, can lead to anxieties over one's own contribution and an unease about contingency. In an influential essay entitled Generational Difficulties, Judith Ruth describes this as the parents' angst, premised upon the fear of a barren history.
What's the content I talked about?
Or was it just?
Just no.
I've said yes and no. Neither seems to work. Oh well. Where did I get to? Okay. In an influential essay entitled Generational Difficulties, Judith Ruth describes this as the parents' angst, premised upon the fear of a barren history, a fear that the next generation will refuse to follow in the footsteps of their foremothers, or will reject their mother's model entirely and commence a new and different battle. Ruth's argument is that propagating generational and matrilineal paradigms is a way of staking a claim in history, making one's mark and trying to direct the future to fulfill the goals and dreams of the past. The generational mother-daughter trope, in Ruth's account, thereby represents a relation of control that prevents unruly feminists escaping the law of legacy and debt. And this so-called parental anxiety is not unfounded, as the model of generational or matrilineal succession can indeed provoke... I'm just going to get rid of it, I think. I've got a handout actually, so I'll give it out later. Okay, so this so-called parental anxiety is not unfounded, as the model of generational or matrilineal succession can indeed provoke a desire in younger feminists to break out of the chain and begin anew, when they experience the burden of legacy in negative terms. The model of generational matrilineal legacy can thus instill a sense of anxiety among both older and younger feminists, giving rise to a conception of feminist history as a struggle between competing generations. One of the most common criticisms is that familial maternal models cast feminist relations in Oedipal terms. Although the central theme of the Oedipal drama is the father-son relationship, more generally it depicts intergenerational relationships through the lens of rivalry, prohibition, frustration, repression, deferral, rebellion, and entitlement. The argument of Ruth, among others, is that generational matrilineal paradigms inevitably import the full force of Oedipal rivalry, recrimination, and debt into relations between feminists, which means that tensions and conflicts between feminists are overinterpreted in terms of unavoidable tensions between overbearing mothers or undutiful daughters. Further, she argues, generational logic also imports patrimonial understandings of exchange, whereby ideas and practices are regarded as property that is not shared but handed down and endowed on the next generation. From this perspective, then, depicting feminist histories in terms of generational or matrilineal legacy can be read as a kind of inverted patriarchy with an M. Female-to-female inheritance, it is true, has always been problematic within patriarchal societies and cultures in which the legacy passed from male to male is understood as natural and of central importance. As Irigaray has forcefully argued, mother-daughter relations in patriarchal or patrilineal societies are subordinated to relations between men, and as such, the between-men cultures of patriarchy, as she terms it, offer no suitable ways of symbolizing and cultivating between-women cultures, socialities, and genealogies. She explains that Oedipus is the emblem of this patriarchal genealogical cultural order because of its division of genealogy into, quote, one or two family triangles, all sired by the male. From this perspective, the political matricide, which pits younger feminists against older feminists, arises because there's no adequate alternative to the patriarchal hierarchical rules and meanings governing genealogical and intergenerational relations. In other words, according to Irigaray, to conduct themselves in social life, women are forced to mimic patriarchal kinship patterns and relationships modelled upon Oedipal rivalry, descent, and debt. The Oedipal drama has certainly been foundational to the conception of social relations and cultural transmission within Western cultural theory, primarily due to the influence of Freud and Lacan, and also structural anthropologists such as Claude Lévi-Strauss. The theories and rubrics produced by these influential figures do offer many useful insights into how patriarchal cultural logics and structures maintain and reproduce themselves. However, by granting them too much explanatory and imaginary power, we allow them to overdetermine our analyses and block out instances of relations which do not conform to the Oedipal logic. So in this paper, I want to resist the temptation to denounce all kinds of generational and maternal symbolism and imagery within feminism as essentially Oedipal, and instead investigate areas of study which are beginning to interrupt the pervasiveness of Oedipus as an analytic and mythic formulation. This requires us to travel across various disciplines where feminist theorists and scholars are trying to think and theorize generational relations and maternal models outside of the dominant Oedipal and patriarchal paradigms, and to cultivate more nuanced and historically and contextually sensitive approaches. It will be impossible to give a detailed account of all the ways in which this is happening within different disciplinary contexts, of course, but the aim for the rest of the paper is to sketch out a few examples, concentrating on innovations within psychoanalytic theory, anthropology and social theory, and finally literature and literary criticism. Okay, so we'll start with psychoanalytic theory. Lacanian theory has had a huge influence over feminist theory, and as stated, has provided some useful analytic insights into how patriarchal cultural logics and structures maintain and reproduce themselves. At the same time, however, feminists have recognized the limitations of the Lacanian system for trying to think the female, the feminine, and the maternal. For Irigaray, for example, Lacan's psychoanalytic theory is useful in that it helps to demonstrate the fundamentally patriarchal foundations of Western culture, i.e. that, quote, what is now termed the Oedipal structure is access to the cultural order is already structured within a single masculine line of filiation, which doesn't symbolize the woman's relationship to her mother. The problem, however, is that psychoanalytic theory has propped up this patriarchal symbolic order by making Oedipalization seem inevitable. In Lacanian theory, Oedipalization is cast as the inaugural structure of language and subjectivity, whereby the law in the name of the father intervenes in the supposed mother-child fusion to mark the child's entry into the realm of the symbolic. If we accept this theory, as Judith Butler has forcefully argued, then Oedipus becomes the very mark and normative condition of culture itself. That is, although Lacan shifts the grounds of our understanding of patriarchal power relations and their social reproduction away from the biological orientation of Freud towards socio-linguistic processes, he nevertheless formulates this structure on the basis of an inevitable law that the maternal relation always has to be sacrificed and left behind. Thus, in Lacan's work, as Elizabeth Gross has argued, quote, patriarchal dominance is not so much challenged as displaced from biology to the equally unchangeable socio-linguistic law of the father. In sum, the idea that the name and law of the father is a necessary regulator of desire and intersubjective communication makes patriarchal authority and patrilineal kinship structures seem inevitable. At points in her work, as referenced above, Irigaray paints a rather gloomy picture of female relations under patriarchal conditions. However, at the heart of her theoretical project is a desire to interrupt the seeming inevitability of Oedipalization and its erasure of the maternal, propelled by her insistence that, quote, the Oedipal paradigm only seems like the only order possible because it refuses to regard itself as myth. Granted, the Oedipal myth is not simply a fantasy, but rather can be seen as a symptom in that it has a symbolic logic that accounts for a real mode of functioning and a real structure of relations. Nevertheless, Irigaray's claim here dramatises the vital idea that whilst Oedipal modes may well have dominated familial and generational relationships under patriarchal conditions, their symbolic logic and mythic manifestations can in principle be interrupted and unsettled. In this sense, Irigaray belongs to a tradition of feminist theorists who seek to develop a more transformative and flexible approach to psychoanalytic theory, forcing psychoanalysis to investigate its own historical determinants and using psychoanalytic concepts and methods to try and find a place for maternal genealogy within accounts of intersubjectivity, individuation and enculturation. One of the principal imperatives here is to challenge the story of originary mother-child fusion and the need for separation from the mother. One example includes Irigaray's postulation of a maternal order founded on a placental economy. The idea of a maternal order and placental economy is not developed in much detail in Irigaray's work, but its value, I suggest, lies in gesturing towards an alternative psychoanalytic account which does not depend upon a transcendence of the maternal. In short, I'll try and summarise. Whilst the patriarchal imagination has represented the relation between mother and child in utero as one of fusion that needs to be broken up and regulated by the paternal function, Irigaray suggests that by paying attention to the mediating role played by the placenta, we can formulate an alternative formative account whereby mother and child are already separate though conjoined, as the placenta facilitates regulative exchanges between mother and fetus, negotiating between the mother's self and the other within. Whilst Lacan claims that genuine exchange depends upon the intervention of the paternal third term, the figure of the placenta implies that the third term is already there. Culture, argues Irigaray, quote, is yet to give interpretation to the model of tolerance of the other within and with the self that this relationship manifests, and as such has failed to recognise or appreciate the almost ethical character of the fetal relation and the placental economy. But it provides a promising ground for a maternal order which does not depend upon the intervention of paternal law. So through psychoanalytic interventions such as this, which open up alternative models of relationality, individuation and enculturation, Irigaray begins to interrupt and unsettle the dominance of the Oedipal dynamic. Another example of an innovator who tries to move beyond the Oedipal overdetermination of psychoanalytic theory is Bracha Ettinger, though there's not time to try and offer a sketch of her work on the matrixial here. The key point is that via work such as Irigaray's and Ettinger's, psychoanalytic theory can serve as a site within which the maternal relation can be rethought and re-theorised, which in turn can help introduce different ethical sensibilities and figurations into intergenerational relations between feminists. If Oedipal psychoanalytic theory seals and shores up patriarchal genealogical orders, then the maternal order, or the matrixial, offer ways of re-theorising and reimagining the maternal relation, where the maternal does not need to be sacrificed or negated, but rather plays a vital role within psychic development and cultural life. So, by removing the necessity for daughters to turn away from mothers, the notion of a maternal or matrixial order could therefore invite a non-conflictual understanding of the mother-daughter relation and relations between women more generally, thereby initiating new pathways between feminisms and between feminists. How are we doing? A second site of innovative thinking around motherhood and maternal emblems is the field of anthropology and social theory. In an article entitled "Is Kinship Always Already Heterosexual?" for example, Judith Butler affirms the potential of an emerging approach within anthropology which she describes as post-kinship studies, referring to a body of work which theorises kinship as a kind of doing, a shifting practice or a mobile classificatory technology that enacts and encodes a specific assemblage of significations as it takes place. Ultimately, she suggests, post-kinship theorists relax the distinction between the symbolic and the social, because the presumption that social relations and practices have the power to undermine and transform the symbolic order of rules governing those social relations implies finally that, quote, the symbolic does not precede the social and has no independence from it. This means that hegemony is eminently challengeable at the level of social, political and historical practice. The post-kinship approach thus shows that symbolic orders can be understood as shifting structures which fluctuate and mutate due to changing historical determinations. This is well exemplified in Hortense Spiller's illuminating essay on genealogical symbolics within the African American context. I'm going to hand out the bibliography afterwards, in which she discusses the impact of the Atlantic slave trade upon the kinship patterns and gendered subject positions which structure African American life in the United States. Spiller's core argument here is that the intertwinement of kinship relations and property relations under slavery show that gendered subject positions and structures of kinship adhere to no symbolic integrity. This is, of course, not to say that African peoples in the New World did not maintain emotional connections and imagined continuities, which are what make blood relations meaningful in the first place. Her point, rather, is that histories of slavery demonstrate that the meanings of family, genealogy, and kinship are shifting and contingent, and at the mercy of property relations determined by racialized symbolic structures. I've got a long quote here which I was going to put up, but I'm going to skip it in the interest of time. But essentially, by tracing a different symbolic history, Spiller's essay reveals a rigorized representation of maternal genealogies and woman-to-woman sociality to in fact be biased towards a certain kind of cultural experience. For instance, Irigaray claims that under Western patriarchy, women's genealogical links are severed because of patrimonial and patrilineal kinship structures under which women are, quoted, abducted from their ancestors and exchanged between patriarchal family units. Yet Spiller's historically sensitive analysis shows how genealogical relations can be severed and shaped in different ways, as slavery forced the separation of children from both their mother and father, instigating a traumatic, symbolic destruction of the social significations of kinship, gender, and name. Spiller's essay also shows how the unsettling of the law in the name of the father within the context of enslavement has resulted in a unique position for African American women, which, quote, places her out of the traditional symbolics of the female gender. Legal enslavement removed the African American male from the prevailing social function of the name in the law of the father, she explains, therefore setting a dual fatherhood in motion, comprised of, quote, the African father's banished name and body, and the captive father's mocking presence. On the one hand, the perceived absence of the father's symbolic mark upon the African American family has resulted in persistent pathologization of the African American family and its supposed matriarchal structure, and we see the same thing with black British families in the UK. Yet on the other hand, the unsettling of the law in the name of the father within the context of enslavement, Spillers argues, gives way to, quote, a potentially monstrous symbolic position, a female with the potential to name. Another theorist who explores the legacies of slavery, imperialism and colonialism upon kinship and familial relations and paradigms within both the African American but also the black British context is Hazel Carby, but once again there's no time to outline her work here, but the point is that the subtleties and complexities of work by theorists such as Spillers and Carby means that feminist theorists must think twice before making grand claims about the cultural meaning and symbolic logics of generational and familial paradigms. Instead, we need to consider how different histories yield different representational and relational potentialities for different groups and individuals. This is recognised by Madhu Dubey, for example, who argues that the history of black motherhood gives the matrilineal paradigm a particular resonance within contemporary black feminist criticism, where chosen kinship can be interpreted as a strategy for overcoming a specific and brutal history of dislocation and disinheritance by means of fictional, familial, and cultural connection. Being sensitive to historical resonances does not require suspension of a critical perspective. Dubé is keenly aware of the hazards of using generational and matrilineal metaphors within feminist literary criticism, discussing the dangers of consolidating and idealizing a fragmented past, and of positing the maternal figure as a guarantor of temporal continuity and an authentic feminine identity. However, whilst recognising the potential pitfalls of matrilineal configurations, Dubé pays particular attention to the ways in which histories of slavery have shaped experiences of black motherhood and familial relations, and thereby condition the project of cultural and historical construction and reconstruction within black feminist discourse. Okay, so I've got a couple of minutes, I think. I just want to point to a final site for transformation, which is that of literature and literary criticism. And my example will be Dubé's reading of Gail Jones's blues novel, Corregidora. So once again, the context is African American, so it's cheating a little bit in this network that's supposed to be focusing on European writing. But it is such a good example that I do want to share it. So the novel recounts the experiences of blues singer Ursa Corregidora and the relationships of 3 generations of her maternal ancestors with their Portuguese slave owner Corregidora. Structurally, the novel oscillates between the narrator Ursa's reflections on her present situation and passages which express the flood of memories of stories told to her by her mother, grandmother and great-grandmother about their pasts. A flood which shapes and constantly interrupts Ursa's present and her orientations towards the future. As Dubé describes it, quote, "The novel's structure so thoroughly fuses Ursa's story with the history of her foremothers that any distinction between past and present becomes inoperative. In this regard, the novel effectively demonstrates the imbrication of past and present, overturning any conception of a neatly bounded generational perspective or a step-by-step generational succession. Alongside this temporal ambiguity, the novel also gives a strong sense of the emotional and relational ambiguity that underpins the process of tradition building and cultural inheritance. In many respects, Jones depicts the matrilineal legacy as a debilitating burden, as Ursa's fragmented memories of the stories told to her by her maternal ancestors repeatedly erupt into her narrative, stalling her attempt to transcend history and to create a new story for herself. As such, Dubé argues, Jones challenges the assumption that the mother's past should provide the ground for the daughter's utterance. Nevertheless, even as she dwells upon the onerous and potentially hazardous aspects of generational legacy, Jones does not fall into the trap of privileging sheer contradiction and discontinuity. Rather, her novel, Dubé argues, manages to admirably negotiate the interplay between continuity and discontinuity within the genealogical relationship through its structural reliance on the blues method of repetition with variation, or repetition with difference. So I'll finish with a quote here, which I really like. So she says, "Always articulating contradiction within a structure of relation, this method engages the past in a manner different from both an Oedipal model of tradition, based on generational rivalry, and a matrilineal model with its affirmation of generational unity. The novel's structure of repetition with difference denies an exclusive privileging of either generational conflict or continuity, and offers instead a model of tradition that holds the past and the present in a state of creative disequilibrium." So to conclude, the guiding idea behind this paper has been that the theoretical paradigms and figurative tropes we use to understand, describe and engage with feminism have real effects in the world and upon the ways in which feminists develop intergenerational relationships and participate in intergenerational dialogue. One response to the increasing concern that mother-daughter tropes are exacerbating conflicts and tensions between feminists and deflecting attention from external battles against sexism, racism and homophobia is to simply declare a moratorium upon all use of generational or matrilineal metaphors. My own view, however, is that this kind of gesture is too generalising, overlooking the variety of significations that maternal metaphors can hold within different discursive fields, and serving as a didactic gesture which tells all feminists everywhere how to understand and figure their feminist relationships. A more productive approach, I've argued, is to consider the diverse approaches to maternal structures, paradigms and tropes being taken within different disciplines and discourses as a means of rethinking the metaphorical maternal in much more nuanced and sensitive terms, and also demonstrating that maternal models and metaphors are not always, and need not be, inevitably divisive or stifling. The point of trying to interrupt and think beyond Oedipus is not to rein in and reduce all forms of relations between women and feminists to an idealised version of the maternal relation, uncontaminated by patriarchal or masculinist logics. The point rather is that Oedipal imaginaries and symbolics are not incontrovertible, that it is possible to think outside the constraints of patriarchal paradigms and imagine generational relations and temporalities in a way much more conducive to forging productive feminist relationships. Thank you.